The bride is in her finest dress. The groom is beside her. The guests have already had plenty to drink. Then the door swings open, and in walks the Lord, the master of these lands. Without a word, he takes the bride by the hand and leads her away. The first night is his. The groom stands frozen. There's no point arguing. That's the law. You've seen this scene before. But how does an entire society put up with that for centuries? How did it actually work, on paper and in practice? Hollywood and historical novelists love this scene for winding up the drama. It never fails. It disgusts you and flatters you at the same time. Our ancestors were savages, and we, of course, have come a long way. The custom has a name, and more than one. The famous droit du seigneur, the Lord's right. In Latin, ius primae noctis, the right of the first night, and with no delicacy at all, droit de cuissage, the right of the thigh. Notice the word itself. A right, not a crime you could be hauled into court for, but something owed, like a tithe, like rent, and the claim is always the same. A peasant marries, and on the wedding night his bride belongs not to her husband but to the Lord, not as the whim of one vicious man, but as a custom, lawful, recognized, expected. It has everything a good historical horror needs: sex, power, humiliation, class arrogance, and roles you can read at a glance. A victim, a monster, and a whole system protecting the monster. A story like that needs no explaining. You hear it once and you have it for life. So let's look at how the system worked, which means opening the archives. Medieval Europe was obsessive about paperwork. We still have the law codes, the charters, the court rolls, the manor records, the endless lists of who owed what to whom. These people wrote down everything. What cost a penny, what earned a fine, how a marriage was registered, how property changed hands. You'd expect to find the paperwork that governed this. A notification procedure, lists of peasant brides who fell under the law. Some document, any document, you could actually enforce the right with. And here's the first odd thing. It turns out the groom could simply pay the Lord a sum of money, and the bride was left alone. And that money, handed over before the wedding, really is in the records, an ancient, unshakable right to a woman's body. And the Lord will give it up for a handful of coin. Remember that coin. We'll come back to it. For now, let's go looking for the legal text itself, the one that establishes the right. And here we run into an unexpected problem. Every so often, somebody triumphantly produces an old document and announces they've found the proof. Historians take a closer look, and the paper turns out to be a later pamphlet, basically the tabloid of its day, or a satire, or a retelling of a retelling, or a footnote pointing at another footnote, which points at nothing at all. There's another favorite move: appeal to antiquity. Claim it was always this way, all the way back to the Sumerians and Gilgamesh himself. Pull that thread and you'll find a very generous reading of some old myth, or a man stating it with total confidence and no evidence whatsoever. Good trick, by the way. The deeper the roots are said to go, the less likely anyone is to check whether there are any. Now look at this through the eyes of the man running the estate. The peasant wasn't some faceless creature grubbing in the mud. He was the Lord's main economic asset. His rent, his labor, his children and their labor, all of it fed the manor. The peasant family was a working part of that machine. Now turn your own tenants' wedding nights into a standing invitation to rage, sabotage, flight, and revenge. That isn't a show of strength. It's a catastrophic way to run a business. Lords could be greedy, cruel, stupid, and remarkably arrogant. But why keep up a custom for centuries that drains your own treasury and breeds enemies on your own land? It doesn't add up. Then there's the court record. Medieval peasants knew how to complain, and they stood up for their rights constantly. We still have their endless suits, over mills, over firewood, over grazing rights, over fees, over the smallest indignities of ordinary life. They went to court over anything. And in all that bureaucratic noise, there is not one complaint about this particular law. Not a single case where a lord stands up and demands a woman as his legal right. People who sued over firewood said nothing about their brides being taken. That silence is exactly what the French medievalist Alain Bourreau went after. He spent years tracing every claimed piece of evidence back to its source. Who wrote it first, who they cited, and what was actually in the text they cited. His conclusion is simple. There is no reliable evidence that a legal right of the first night ever existed. Not a scrap. This isn't a forgotten law, it's a well-built myth. One caveat here, because this is exactly where people get it wrong. The medieval nobility were no saints. Men with power robbed, made war, and committed sexual violence. In any age, they take what they want. But violence as brute force and a crime is one thing. Violence written into law as a legal, recognized norm is something else entirely. And it's the second one historians cannot find. All right, there was no law. So where did the story come from? Because it didn't come from nowhere. And this is where the real history begins, grubbier and a good deal more cynical than any Hollywood fairy tale. Remember that odd little detail from the start, that you could always just pay the right of the first night away? That's the whole answer, right there. There was never a legal right to the bride's body. There was a bill. It was called merchet, a marriage tax a dependent peasant paid his lord for permission to marry off a woman in his household. And it bit hardest when the bride was marrying out of the manor altogether. The lord's reasoning was pure business. Lose the woman, and you lose her hands, her future children, and every penny they'd have brought in. He wasn't interested in anybody's bed. He was interested in the balance sheet of the marriage. And merchet didn't work alone. There were other fees in the system. Lehrwhite, a fine for sex before marriage. Childwhite, a fine for a child born out of wedlock. The estate quite literally put a tax on a peasant's private life, not out of any concern for their morals, but because a peasant family, their bodies and their labor were valuable stock on the books. So there's your whole nightmare. The Lord did have a genuine right to step into a marriage, but he was after the purse, not what was under the skirt. Take the fee, stop a useful worker from marrying away, fine people for stepping out of line. This isn't a lust-crazed monster. It's a petty, money-grubbing taxman. But the centuries rolled on, and somebody very skillfully pulled the most scandalous reading imaginable out of all that dull bookkeeping. A fee for a bride leaving the estate became a right to her virginity. Paying your tax became buying your way out of rape. A boring ledger entry got itself dressed up as a historical horror film. And once it's wearing that costume, the lie is impossible to kill because it hits you in the gut, and it feels truer than the truth. But a clerk's tax doesn't turn itself into a blood-soaked legend on its own. Somebody dressed it up like that, quite deliberately, which leaves us with the most interesting question of all. Who did it? And what were they after? Now for the real question. Who needed all of us to believe this? Because a myth like this doesn't grow on its own. Someone has to repeat it, polish it, make it respectable, and put it into circulation. And, as usual, the people who pushed it hardest weren't medieval peasants. They were much later, much better educated, and they had an axe to grind. By the early modern period, and especially across the 18th and 19th centuries, the Lord's right had become far too useful a symbol to leave alone. Enlightenment writers wanted the old order to look not just unjust, but physically disgusting. And the historical novelists, the politicians on their platforms, and the popular stage were only too happy to take the baton. And wherever it landed, the myth flourished. It squeezed a whole tangled system of dues and rights and obligations into one unforgettable image. It let you skip the boring question of how feudal society actually functioned and jump straight to the satisfying one. Why the old world deserved to be hated. proof just got in the way. The symbol was worth more than the fact. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Political mythology almost always prefers a picture to an archive. It doesn't want a careful, well-sourced document. It wants a 10-second scene you can repeat in a single breath, one that tells everyone instantly who the villain is. Which is precisely how this legend survived for centuries, and slipped, without the slightest resistance, into 20th century pop culture. After Braveheart, millions of people knew about Prima Nocta, not from a chronicle, not from a legal historian, certainly not from a medievalist, but from a film that needed one clean, instantly hateable reason to despise its feudal villain. And the film handed it over, neat and undiluted. And that's how the lie completes its circle. A hint to begin with, then a literary flourish, then a politically handy illustration, and finally, the blockbuster. After which the myth comes back to us wearing the badge of, well, everyone knows that. And at every single step, somebody collects. The playwright takes his applause, the pamphleteer takes his symbol, the politician takes a past he can point at, the director takes his big scene, and the audience takes home a nice, simple, comforting map of who the good guys are. So the most famous sexual atrocity of feudalism was, in all likelihood, a right the lords never actually held. And don't mistake me, real lords were no saints. They robbed, they made war, they raped, they extorted, they burned, and they enjoyed their power with rather more relish than the romantics of the Middle Ages like to picture. But violence is a crime, an act of brute force, an abuse, that's one thing. Violence written into law as a recognized official norm is something else entirely. And it's that second one the historians simply never find. So this was never really a story about how monstrous feudalism was. We knew that already. It's a story about what people do best. Take what doesn't fit their view of the world, make it a monster, and turn that monster into a tidy symbol of evil. Because a symbol outlives a fact. But let's be honest with ourselves. This stopped being a story about the Middle Ages a while ago. It's a masterclass in how we still think today. Centuries on, the mechanism hasn't changed one bit. And it doesn't operate somewhere out there, in the back rooms of high politics. It runs every single day inside your own head. Think of the boss you can't stand, your ex, or the neighbor's cat that keeps leaving its little presents on your doorstep. You're not about to dig deep and hunt for the real reasons behind what they do. Who's got the time or the patience? You just invent a convenient villain to pin it all on, and you do it for one reason only, to make your own life that little bit simpler. A dull reality like they were just in a bad mood doesn't really explain anything. But a story about absolute evil convinces you in an instant, it gathers sympathy, it justifies any amount of hatred, and it hands you the comfortable right to be the innocent victim. The complicated, boring truth almost always loses to a lurid scare story. The scare story hits you in the gut straight away. Reality almost never does. Now just scale it up, from your ex to an entire nation. And there you have the essence of all propaganda. So the myth of the right of the first night is no museum piece. It's a living modern weapon, and it never misfires. If you enjoyed watching a dull little marriage fee grow into one of the most stubborn legends of the Middle Ages, subscribe. History writes the headlines. We read the fine print.